I was 5 years old when my sister left me to die. I remember the exact moment lying on the forest floor, my chest crushing in on itself, gasping for air that wouldn't come. The asthma attack hit like a fist. I reached for Vicky, begging her to get help. She looked at me with wide eyes, turned around, and ran, not toward our parents, away from me. I heard the car engine start, gravel crunching under tires, then silence except for my own wheezing, growing weaker by the second. A stranger found me that day. He saved my life, then disappeared before my family even arrived at the hospital. 31 years later, I stood in a courtroom while that same sister sued me for $8.5 million money left to me by the man who rescued me, a man I later discovered was a hidden tycoon who'd been watching my family for decades. Vicky sat at the plaintiff's table, smirking confident she'd take everything. Then the evidence came out, and that smirk vanished. What would you do if you discovered your whole family had been lying to you your entire life? My name is Brianna Fox. I'm 36 years old, an accountant at a small firm in Portland, and for most of my life, I've measured success not by what I have, but by what I've survived. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, right as I was reviewing a client's tax return. My phone buzzed with an unknown number. Normally, I'd ignore it, probably a scammer or a collections agency, following up on one of the medical bills I was still paying off from last year's asthma hospitalization. But something made me answer. Ms. Fox, this is Margaret Chen from Patterson and Associates law firm. I'm calling about Harold Mercer. I'm afraid he passed away yesterday evening. I set down my pen. The fluorescent lights above my desk seemed to flicker, though they probably didn't. Harold Mercer, the man who carried me out of those woods 31 years ago. The man who 8 years ago had legally become my father, the only real father I'd ever known. The funeral is Saturday, the lawyer continued. Mr. Mercer left specific instructions. He wanted you there, and Ms. Fox there, are matters regarding his estate that we need to discuss with you personally. I hung up and stared at my computer screen without seeing it. My tiny apartment would be waiting for me after work. 600 square feet of independence that I'd fought for every single month. Student loans from the degree my parents refused to fund. Medical bills that insurance never quite covered. A salary that kept me alive but never comfortable. But I'd built that life myself. Every struggling inch of it was mine. Growing up in the Fox household, I learned early that I was the wrong kind of daughter. I was born with severe asthma, the kind that sends you to the emergency room at 2 a.m, that requires expensive medications and careful monitoring and constant worry. My parents didn't hide their exhaustion or their resentment. Vicky was different. 2 years older, perfectly healthy, effortlessly charming. She was the daughter they wanted. I was the daughter they got stuck with. But it wasn't just favoritism. I noticed things even as a child. The way my father looked at me, sometimes not with disappointment, but with something colder. Calculation. Like I was a problem he was still figuring out how to solve. I was 5 when I finally understood how little my life meant to them. That day in the woods still visits me in dreams. The family picnic at a remote hiking trail, a location my father chose, despite my mother's concerns about the dust and pollen. He suggested that Vicky take me for a short walk on the trail, just the two of us, no adults. When I collapsed when my airways closed and the world started going gray, Vicky ran. I don't blame her entirely. She was 7. She was scared. But she didn't run for help. She ran away. And when she told my parents she couldn't find me, my father didn't panic. He didn't call for search parties. He didn't race down the trail. He said, "She probably wandered off. Let's give her time to find her way back." They waited almost 2 hours. I would have died on that forest floor if not for a stranger, a man who appeared from nowhere, scooped me into his arms, and drove me to the hospital himself. He stayed until the doctor said I would live. Then he vanished, leaving behind only 5 words for the nurses. Someone who should have acted sooner. My parents arrived 2 hours after the hospital called. My mother's only explanation then and forever after was simple. You wandered off. It was your own fault. And for 31 years, I thought that man was a random hiker who happened to save my life. I was wrong. He'd been watching my father for years because my father had done something far worse than leaving me in the woods. I didn't learn the truth about Harold Mercer until I was 18 years old, the day I left for college with a scholarship I'd earned myself and a suitcase full of secondhand clothes. My parents didn't drive me to campus. They didn't even say goodbye. I took a bus, and when I arrived at my tiny dorm room, there was a letter waiting for me. No return address, just my name written in careful handwriting. The letter was from the man who saved me in the woods 13 years earlier. He introduced himself as Harold Mercer, and he told me things that made my hands shake as I read. He said he wasn't a random hiker that day. He said he had been watching my family from a distance because my father, Richard Fox, had destroyed his life. They'd been business partners once along with a third man. My father had defrauded Harold, stolen everything he'd built, and nearly sent him to prison on false charges. Harold had spent years rebuilding from nothing, and he'd never stopped watching the man who ruined him. He said the day in the woods wasn't an accident. He said my father knew exactly what he was doing when he sent 2 little girls alone onto that trail. At the bottom of the letter, Harold had written his phone number and a single line. I understand if you don't trust me. I just wanted you to know the truth about that day in the woods. Call if you ever need anything. No strings attached. I threw the letter away. This man had every reason in the world to hate my father. How did I know he wasn't using me to get revenge? How did I know anything he said was true? I was 18 alone, exhausted from years of being treated like I didn't matter. I didn't have room in my life for another person who might hurt me. So I crumpled up that letter and tossed it in the trash, and I told myself I'd never think about Harold Mercer again. But I couldn't bring myself to throw away that phone number. I copied it into a notebook, just in case. I didn't know why. Maybe some part of me already knew I'd need it someday. 3 years later, I was 21 and barely surviving. I worked 2 jobs while taking a full course load. I slept 4 hours a night. My body couldn't handle the stress, and my asthma came back with a vengeance. I ended up in the emergency room twice in 1 month, and the bills piled up fast. I needed medication I couldn't afford. My insurance denied coverage, calling it a pre-existing condition. I swallowed every ounce of pride I had and called my parents. I didn't ask for much, just enough to cover the medication until I could get back on my feet. My mother answered. I explained the situation, trying to keep my voice steady, trying not to sound desperate, even though I was. Her response was immediate. You chose to leave this family. You chose to go to that school instead of staying close to home. Figure it out yourself. She hung up. I sat in my tiny apartment that night, struggling to breathe, wondering if this was how my story would end. Alone, broke, gasping for air that wouldn't come. And then I remembered that phone number I'd saved 3 years ago. I didn't ask Harold for money when I called. I just asked him one question. Was what you wrote in that letter true? He didn't hesitate. Every word. But I don't expect you to believe me. Let me help you first. Consider it what your father owes me. Paid forward. Within 2 days, my medical bills were paid. The medication I needed arrived at my door. Harold asked for nothing in return. He didn't push me to meet him. He didn't demand that I listen to more accusations about my father. He just helped, and then he waited. I called him again a few weeks later. Then again a month after that. Slowly, carefully, I started asking questions. He answered every single one with patience and evidence. He showed me documents. He explained the business partnership, the fraud, the betrayal. He never raised his voice. He never badmouthed my parents beyond stating facts. He just told me the truth and let me decide what to do with it. Over the years, Harold became the father I never had. He showed up for my birthday every year with a small gift and a card. He came to my college graduation when my own parents didn't bother to attend. When my asthma landed me in the hospital again at 25, he sat beside my bed for 3 days, reading books aloud to keep me company. He never asked for anything. He never made me feel like a burden. He just loved me consistently and unconditionally in a way no one ever had before. When I was 28, after a decade of Harold proving himself through actions rather than words, I asked him something I'd been thinking about for years. I asked if I could legally become his daughter. He cried when I asked. It was the first time I'd ever seen him cry. He agreed, but he made me promise to listen carefully to what he was about to say. Your father is more dangerous than you realize, he told me. I've spent years gathering evidence of what he's done, not just to me, but to others. There was a man named James Porter. He died because of your father. When I'm gone, people will come for you because of what I'm leaving behind. Trust the process I've put in place. And remember the name Eleanor Webb. She's a nurse who was there the day I brought you to the hospital. She remembers everything. She keeps a diary. I've stayed in touch with her all these years. I didn't fully understand what he meant, but I trusted him. 8 years of consistent love had earned that trust completely. The will reading took place 5 days after Harold's funeral. His lawyer read it publicly per Harold's instructions. When she announced that I was the sole beneficiary of his estate valued at $8.5 million, I couldn't process it. That money would erase every debt I'd ever carried. Every struggle, every sleepless night, wondering how I'd make rent. But I wasn't the only one in shock. The Fox family had shown up uninvited. Vicky stood in the back of the room with her arms crossed, her face twisted with outrage. My mother looked confused, like she couldn't understand why she wasn't mentioned. And my father stood perfectly still, his expression calm, controlled, revealing nothing. That night I received a voicemail from an unknown number. I didn't answer, but when I played the message, I realized it wasn't meant for me. My father had accidentally called my number while talking to someone else. His voice was tense, urgent, nothing like the calm mask he'd worn at the will reading. Find out what else he left her. Documents, files, anything. That bastard was collecting evidence for 30 years. If she has it, we need to know before... The message cut off abruptly. He must have realized his mistake. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying those words over and over. Evidence. 30 years. What had Harold discovered? What was my father so desperate to hide? 3 weeks later, Vicky filed a lawsuit demanding the entire $8.5 million, claiming Harold had defrauded our father decades ago. But I knew the truth now. My father wasn't the victim. He was the one hiding something, and he was terrified of what Harold left behind. The lawsuit dragged on for 10 months. 10 months of depositions, motions, and legal maneuvering that cost me sleep and sanity. Vicky's claim was simple on the surface. Harold Mercer had built his fortune on money he supposedly stole from Richard Fox 35 years ago, and therefore the inheritance rightfully belonged to the Fox family. She painted herself as the victim of a scheming outsider who had manipulated her vulnerable sister. She told the press I had abandoned my real family for a stranger's money. She conveniently forgot that she hadn't spoken to me in years, except to ask for favors. But as the pre-trial hearings progressed, I noticed something strange. Vicky's lawyer kept asking questions that had nothing to do with money. Where did Harold keep his personal files? Did he have a safe deposit box? Were there storage units? Had I found any documents among his belongings? The questions were relentless, specific, and increasingly desperate. I remembered the voicemail my father had accidentally left me. He wasn't looking for money. He was looking for evidence. Harold had spent 30 years gathering proof of something, and my father was terrified it would surface. Vicky was just the puppet. Richard was pulling the strings. I decided to pull some strings of my own. Harold had given me a name before he died, Eleanor Webb, a nurse who remembered everything, who kept a diary. I spent weeks tracking her down, following a trail of old hospital records and retirement community directories, until I found her living in a small apartment in Eugene, Oregon. She was 78 years old, sharp as a knife, and she had been waiting 3 decades for someone to ask her what she knew. Eleanor showed me the diary she'd kept throughout her nursing career. She opened it to an entry dated 31 years ago, the day Harold brought me to the emergency room. Her handwriting was neat and precise. The entry read, 5-year-old girl, severe asthma attack, found alone in woods. Man who brought her in said the family left her there. Car drove away while she was dying. He was shaking. Said he'd been watching them for years because of something the father did. What kind of parents leave their child to die? I asked Eleanor if she would testify. She looked me straight in the eyes and said she'd been waiting 31 years to tell someone the truth. The trial began on a cold Monday morning. The courtroom was packed. Vicky sat at the plaintiff's table looking confident, dressed in an expensive suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. My mother sat behind her confused and out of place, and my father sat perfectly still in the gallery watching everything with those cold, calculating eyes I remembered from childhood. Against my lawyer's advice, I requested to take the stand myself. I needed the jury to hear the truth from my own lips, not filtered through legal arguments and objections. When I sat in that witness chair and looked out at the courtroom, I felt a calm I hadn't expected. I had spent my whole life being silenced. Not anymore. I told them about the day in the woods. Every detail I could remember. the dusty trail, the tightness in my chest, the moment I collapsed and reached for my sister. I described how Vicky had looked at me with wide eyes and then turned and ran not toward our parents but away from me entirely. I told them how I lay there alone, listening to the car engine start and the gravel crunch as my family drove away. Then I looked directly at Vicky. "You were 7 years old," I said. "Old enough to run back to our parents and tell them I was dying. But instead you told them you couldn't find me, and they believed you because believing you was always easier than looking for me." Vicky's confident expression flickered. She glanced back at our father, but Richard's face revealed nothing. Then I called Eleanor Webb to the stand. She walked slowly but steadily to the witness chair, carrying her diary, like it was sacred. When she read her entry aloud, her voice clear and unwavering, the courtroom fell completely silent. 31 years of truth finally spoken. Vicky's lawyer tried to discredit her. He suggested her memory was faulty, that she was too old to remember clearly. But Eleanor had documentation. She had dates and times and medical records that matched her diary entries exactly. When my lawyer asked Eleanor about the phrase, "something the father did," she nodded slowly. "The man who brought the little girl in Harold, he told me he was gathering evidence against the girl's father. He said there was a business partner who died under suspicious circumstances. He mentioned a name, James Porter." I watched my father when Eleanor said that name. For the first time in my life, I saw Richard Fox lose control of his mask. He stiffened visibly, his hands gripping the bench in front of him. Vicky looked back at him with confusion. She had never heard that name before. But the revelations weren't finished. Vicky's lawyer had spent months arguing that I wasn't a real Fox daughter, that I had abandoned my family and therefore had no moral claim to anything. My lawyer had a response to that. She presented the results of a DNA test I had taken months earlier, along with analysis of samples collected from family items. The results confirmed that I was the biological daughter of Richard and Martha Fox. But Vicky was not. Vicky was Richard's daughter, but not Martha's. She was the product of an affair, another woman's child, that Richard had somehow convinced Martha was her own. I heard my mother gasp from across the courtroom. She hadn't known. For 38 years, she had raised another woman's child, believing Vicky was hers. She had favored Vicky, spoiled Vicky, protected Vicky, all while her actual daughter was treated like garbage. And it was all based on a lie Richard had told her nearly 4 decades ago. Vicky's face went white. The golden child, the favorite daughter, the one who could do no wrong. Her entire identity had been built on her father's deception. But we weren't finished yet. My lawyer approached the judge with a sealed envelope. Harold had left instructions that it should only be opened if there was litigation regarding his estate. The judge allowed it to be entered into evidence. I will never forget the silence in that courtroom as Harold's final letter was read aloud. He explained that Richard Fox had killed a man named James Porter in 1990. James had discovered Richard's embezzlement and planned to expose him. 2 weeks later, James died when his car's brake lines mysteriously failed. Harold had spent decades trying to prove what he suspected, and he finally had. The letter described a mechanic named Donald Vance, whom Richard had hired to sabotage James Porter's car. Donald had been dying of cancer the previous year, and Harold had found him. Donald gave a recorded confession before he passed. Harold also had letters James wrote to his widow expressing fear of Richard and financial records showing Richard paid Donald $15,000 in cash 1 week before James died. Harold's letter concluded with words that shattered what remained of my father's composure. "I have sent copies of everything to the FBI. The investigation began 3 months before my death. Richard isn't just a fraud. He's a murderer. If you're reading this, Richard, you didn't find what you were looking for. You never will." The courtroom erupted. Vicky turned to stare at Richard in horror, finally seeing him for what he was. Richard stood abruptly and mumbled something about needing air, but his lawyer grabbed his arm, trying to stop him from fleeing. My father didn't just leave me in the woods. He tried to make me disappear because I was a loose end in his perfect life. For 35 years, he thought he'd gotten away with murder. He was wrong. Harold made sure of that. And so did I. The aftermath of that courtroom revelation unfolded faster than anyone expected. The judge didn't even wait for closing arguments before making his decision. He dismissed Vicky's lawsuit with prejudice, meaning she could never file it again, could never drag me back into court with the same baseless claims. His written opinion was scathing. He called the case an apparent attempt to access the deceased's files under the guise of an inheritance dispute, and noted that the plaintiff and her family had wasted the court's time with a frivolous claim designed to conceal criminal activity rather than pursue legitimate justice. But the dismissal was just the beginning of Vicky's punishment. The judge ordered her to pay my legal fees in full. 10 months of attorneys' depositions, expert witnesses, and court costs added up to over $200,000. I watched Vicky's face when the judge announced that number. For the first time in her life, she looked genuinely afraid. She had always lived beyond her means, spending money as if our parents' approval came with an unlimited credit line. Now the judgment became a lien on everything she owned: her house, her car, her bank accounts, her retirement funds. Everything she had built her identity around was now collateral for a debt she couldn't pay. The court's opinion became public record within days, and the local news couldn't resist such a dramatic story. Inheritance lawsuit. Backfires exposes decades of family secrets, the headline screamed. Reporters started digging into our family history with relentless enthusiasm. They interviewed former neighbors who remembered the Fox family from decades ago. They found old business associates who had worked with Richard and Harold and James Porter. They located people who remembered James Porter's sudden death 35 years ago and had always thought something didn't add up. The story spread from local news to regional coverage, and suddenly the Fox family's carefully maintained reputation was shattered beyond repair. But the real consequences were still coming for my father. The FBI had been investigating Richard for months before Harold even died. Harold had sent them everything he gathered over 3 decades of patient evidence collection. Donald Vance's video confession was the centerpiece, a dying man describing in detail how Richard Fox paid him $15,000 in cash to cut the brake lines on James Porter's car. Donald named dates, locations, the exact amount of money. He described how Richard approached him, how they arranged the payment, how he had felt guilty for 35 years, but was too afraid to come forward while Richard remained powerful. Harold also had the letters James Porter wrote to his widow in the weeks before his death. James knew something was wrong. He wrote about his fear that Richard would do something drastic to prevent him from exposing the embezzlement. If anything happens to me, one letter read, "Look at Richard. He has the most to lose." James Porter had predicted his own murder and left behind a paper trail pointing directly at his killer. And then there were the bank records showing Richard withdrew exactly $15,000 in cash 1 week before James died, the same amount Donald Vance described receiving. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Now the FBI had one more piece of evidence: the voicemail Richard accidentally left on my phone. His panicked voice searching for documents, talking about evidence that bastard had been collecting for 30 years. That voicemail demonstrated consciousness of guilt, proof that Richard knew exactly what Harold had gathered and was desperate to destroy it. 6 months after the civil trial ended, a federal grand jury indicted Richard Fox on charges of first-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and fraud. The news hit like an earthquake. The man who had spent 35 years pretending to be a respectable businessman was exposed as a cold-blooded killer who had murdered his own partner to cover up embezzlement. Richard's lawyer requested bail, arguing that his client was a lifelong community member with no prior criminal record. The federal judge denied the request immediately, calling Richard a significant flight risk given the severity of the charges and the strength of the evidence. She noted that a man who could hide a murder for 35 years clearly had the capability to disappear if released. At 64 years old, my father was escorted to a federal detention cell to await trial for a murder he committed before I was even born. I didn't attend his arraignment. I didn't need to see him in handcuffs to feel the weight of justice finally arriving. I had spent my whole life wondering why my father looked at me with such coldness, why he seemed to want me to disappear. Now I understood. I was a loose end, a complication, a reminder that his perfect life was built on lies and blood. He had tried to get rid of me in those woods 31 years ago. He failed, and now he would spend the rest of his life paying for everything he had done. Vicky's world collapsed even faster than Richard's. Her husband filed for divorce within weeks of the trial ending. He said he hadn't signed up for this scandal, couldn't build a future with someone whose family was splashed across the news for murder and fraud. Her real estate license was suspended pending an ethics review that everyone knew would end her career permanently. The clients she had cultivated for years disappeared overnight. Nobody wanted to buy a house from the daughter of a murderer. But the cruelest blow came when Vicky tried to find her biological mother. She hired a private investigator, desperate to understand who she really was. The investigator found the truth, and it was worse than anything Vicky could have imagined. Her biological mother was a woman named Sandra Holloway, who had died of cancer 15 years ago alone and forgotten. Sandra had been Richard's mistress in the early years of his marriage. When she got pregnant, Richard threatened her into silence. He told her he would destroy her life if she ever tried to contact the child or reveal the affair. Sandra gave up her baby and spent the rest of her life keeping Richard's secret, dying, without ever knowing the daughter she had been forced to abandon. Vicky was left with nothing: no husband, no career, no identity, no family that wasn't built on lies, and $200,000 in debt that would follow her for the rest of her life. The golden child had been fool's gold all along. My mother's fall was quieter, but no less complete. Martha was subpoenaed to testify in Richard's criminal trial. Under oath, she admitted that she had suspected her husband was capable of terrible things. She said she had seen signs over the years, moments that didn't add up, explanations that felt hollow, but she didn't want to know the truth. She chose ignorance because it was easier than confronting the monster she had married. She wasn't charged with any crime. Legally, she was innocent. But the community didn't see it that way. The church she had attended for 40 years quietly asked her to stop coming. Her relatives cut contact one by one. She sold the house and moved to a small apartment in another state, waiting to testify against the husband she had protected for 35 years. Before she left, Martha asked to see me one last time. We met at a quiet diner on the edge of town. She looked older than I had ever seen her. Her hands trembled as she held her coffee cup. "I didn't know about James Porter," she whispered. "I swear I didn't know he was capable of murder. And I didn't know about Vicky. He told me she was ours. I believed him." I listened without interrupting. I had spent my whole life waiting for her to say something that mattered, something that acknowledged what I had been through. "Maybe you didn't know those things," I said finally. "But you knew about the woods. You knew you left me there for 2 hours before anyone looked. You knew he wanted me gone that day. And you chose to look the other way because it was easier than protecting your own daughter." Martha's face crumpled. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. There was nothing she could say. We both knew it. I stood up from the table. "You spent my whole childhood making me invisible. Now I'm making you invisible to me. We're done." I paid for my coffee at the counter. I walked out of that diner without looking back. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel triumph. I just felt finished. People asked me later if I felt satisfied watching my family destroyed. The truth, I felt nothing. They had been strangers to me my whole life, people who shared my blood, but never my heart. The only father I ever had was already gone, but he left me one final gift, the chance to finally live without their shadow. 2 years have passed since that day in the diner when I walked away from my mother for the last time. 2 years since I decided to stop carrying the weight of people who never wanted me in the first place. And in those 2 years, I have learned something that took me 36 years to understand. There is a difference between surviving and living. I had been surviving my entire life. Now, finally, I was ready to live. I moved into the small house Harold bought for me years ago, back when I didn't understand why he was so insistent that I have a place of my own. It's nothing fancy, just a modest 3-bedroom home on a quiet street with a small garden in the back and neighbors who wave when they see me. But it's the first home that has ever felt safe. The first place where I can close the door at night and know that no one on the other side wishes I would disappear. I painted the walls colors I chose myself. I planted flowers Harold would have liked. I made it mine. I still work as an accountant. Some people thought I would quit after inheriting millions, but they don't understand what work means to someone who spent years fighting for every paycheck. I don't work because I'm desperate anymore. I work because I'm good at it, because I enjoy helping people make sense of their finances, because having a purpose outside my own story keeps me grounded. The difference now is that I work without fear. My student loans are paid off. My medical bills are covered. For the first time in my life, I have savings money set aside for emergencies that won't send me spiraling into panic. I can get sick without wondering if I'll lose everything. I can take a vacation without calculating whether I can afford to miss the hours. That security changed me more than any dollar amount ever could. But money isn't really what transformed my life. What changed me was waking up every morning without dread, without the constant calculation of how I would make rent, how I would pay for medication, how I would survive another month on the razor's edge of disaster. Peace, I discovered, is worth more than any inheritance. Peace is waking up and feeling your shoulders relax because there's no crisis waiting. Peace is drinking coffee slowly instead of gulping it down while running out the door. Peace is knowing that even if something goes wrong, you have the resources and the support to handle it. I never knew what that felt like until I was 36 years old. I'm making up for lost time now. I have real friendships, something I never allowed myself before because I was too busy surviving to let anyone get close. Now I have people who know my whole story, every ugly detail, and stayed anyway. They don't treat me like a victim or a cautionary tale. They treat me like a person worth knowing. And I'm dating someone, a middle school teacher named Daniel, who has absolutely no interest in my inheritance and makes me laugh at the stupidest things. He knows everything about my past, and his response was to hold my hand and say that he was glad I made it through. Life isn't perfect, but it's mine, and that makes all the difference. Harold left me more than money. He left me a mission. 6 months after the trial ended, I established the Harold Mercer Foundation. Its purpose is simple: to help people who were failed by the families that should have protected them. We fund medical care for children with chronic illnesses whose families can't afford treatment, because I know what it feels like to have an inhaler that costs more than your parents think you're worth. We provide legal resources for people fighting inheritance fraud, because I know how easily wealth can be stolen by those who feel entitled to it. And we offer scholarships for students whose families refuse to support their education, exactly what I needed at 18 and never received. The foundation isn't about spite. I don't sit in board meetings thinking about how angry the Foxes would be if they knew what I was doing with Harold's money. I do this work because Harold taught me that pain can become purpose. The worst things that happen to you don't have to define you. They can be transformed into the best things you do for others. Every scholarship we award, every medical bill we pay, every family we help navigate a corrupt system, that's Harold's legacy living on. That's the proof that one person choosing to care can change everything. On the second anniversary of Harold's death, I drove to the county courthouse with a single document in my hand. I had thought about this decision for months, turning it over in my mind until I was certain. The paperwork was simple. The meaning was not. I signed the papers officially changing my name. I am no longer Brianna Fox. That name belonged to a girl who was treated like a burden, like a mistake, like something to be discarded. I am Brianna Mercer, now the daughter of the man who found me in the woods and chose to love me when no one else would. The clerk looked at my paperwork and asked if I was certain. I smiled at her and said I had never been more certain of anything in my life. I spent 36 years carrying the name of people who wished I didn't exist. Now I carry the name of someone who made sure I survived. It's the name I was always supposed to have. Richard Fox was convicted of first-degree murder after an 8-month trial. The jury deliberated for 4 hours before returning a unanimous guilty verdict. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At 66 years old, my biological father will die in a cell smaller than the woods where he once left me to die. I didn't attend the sentencing. I didn't need to see his face when the judge read the verdict. Justice had been served. That was enough. Martha lives alone now in a small town 3 states away, working part-time at a grocery store. Everyone she once knew has abandoned her. The church friends, the social connections, the family members who once admired her, all gone. She exists in isolation, waiting for nothing. Vicky filed for bankruptcy 2 months after the civil trial ended. She lost her house, her car, everything she had built her identity around. She works at a call center now, answering phones for a company that doesn't know or care about her past. She never contacted me again, not to apologize, not to explain, not to make peace. Some people never change. I stopped expecting them to. Every year on the anniversary of the day Harold saved me, I visit his grave. I bring flowers, usually yellow roses, because he once mentioned they were his favorite, and I sit beside his headstone and talk to him like he can still hear me. This year I told him something I've been wanting to say for a long time. I finally understand why you waited, I said. Why you didn't just swoop in and save me when I was little. You knew I had to grow up strong enough to save myself. You just made sure I had the chance. Thank you for seeing me when no one else did. Thank you for fighting for me even when I didn't know you existed. I'm okay now, Dad. I'm finally okay. If you're listening to this story and something in it sounds familiar, if you've ever been the invisible one, the burden, the child they wished would disappear, I want you to know something important. Their inability to love you was never about your worth. It was about their emptiness. You deserved better then, and you deserve better now. It's never too late to build the life they told you that you couldn't have. Family isn't blood. Family is who shows up. Family is who stays. My name is Brianna Mercer, and this is the story of how I stopped surviving and finally started living. Thank you for listening to Brianna's story today. Her journey reminds us of something we often forget. The people who hurt us do not get to define our worth. Sometimes the family we are born into fails us in ways that leave scars we carry for decades. But those scars do not have to be the end of our story. They can become the beginning of something new, something we build for ourselves with people who truly see us and choose to stay. If you have ever felt invisible, overlooked, or unloved by those who should have protected you, please know that their failure was never your fault. You deserved better then, and you deserve better now. It is never too late to find your own herald, someone who believes in you when you have forgotten how to believe in yourself. And it is never too late to become that person for someone else. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel so you never miss another powerful story like this one. Leave a comment below and tell us what you think. Have you ever had to walk away from family to find peace? Have you ever found a chosen family who loved you better than blood? We would love to hear your story. Your voice matters here.